Chapter 1. The Towering Skull. A young black girl about 6 years old stood still in the middle of the block. Her mouth hung open with her eyes fixed on a large burned-out house towering in front of her. The burned-out holes from windows and doors gave the house the eerie appearance of a great skull with a black empty stare. The dead twisted maples beside the house waved in the breeze like bony hands grasping for the girl. She'd been skipping along counting the cracks on the sidewalk. After stumbling over a loose piece in the walkway, she caught her balance and looked up to find herself staring eye to eye with the menacing building. The girl felt as though the house was watching her, following her every move. There she stood motionless and enchanted for what felt like an eternity. She was afraid the slightest motion might draw the wrath of the great skull. Suddenly, a tall young man of about 17 walked up and took her by the hand. "Eliza," in a terse whisper. "Eliza Beth. You know you're not supposed to sneak out on your own. What were you thinking, girl? We must get you back to the home before Miss Johnson knows you've left." He kept glancing around ominously as he addressed the girl, but after one quick glance upward, Eliza's eyes again became fixed on the house. She gave no response and stood there with her mouth still gaping. The young man gave one long look at the house before moving in front of Eliza to block her view. Then she drew her eyes back to center her gaze on him, closed her mouth, and began to rub her thinly clothed arms. For the first time she was aware of how cold she'd become standing motionless in the breeze. "Johnny?" she asked. "Whose house was that?" Johnny gave no verbal response as he took off his heavy fall jacket and slipped it over Eliza's thin sweater. He still had his red plaid overshirt to keep him warm, the same shirt he always wore. Johnny buttoned the front while Eliza tried in vain to work her hands to the ends of the far too long sleeves. Johnny's head bobbed around as he worked, giving Eliza the opportunity to sneak another peek at the house. Eliza was still both fascinated and frightened by the skull house. Johnny fought the desire to turn and check on it himself. Now he was more concerned with who might be about on the streets and kept scanning back and forth in all directions. It was in the early spring of 1964 in the small southern community of Townsend. They were on one of the few gravel side streets left at the outskirts of town. Even the main road at the end of the lane was empty at this early hour on a Saturday. There were few houses this far down any of the side streets, but here there was an even greater gap. It gave a clear view of the fog lying like a cape over the woods stretching behind the home. Eliza resumed her search for information, asking questions like, "How long ago did it burn? I don't remember anyone ever talking about it. What happened to the people? Why don't they fix it? Eliza, Eliza, why must you always ask so many questions? You're always so curious about everything, always want, and never getting any answers," she protested, her voice growing quite loud. It startled her the way it resounded in the still morning air. The echoes trailed off for an uncanny length of time. Johnny was even more startled. "Shush, Eliza. Let's not wake everyone up so early." He quickly scanned their surroundings with wide eyes. His heart was beating so hard that she could feel his pulse as he grasped her hand, turning her away from the direction of the house. Johnny pulled her forward at first as she stared over her shoulder at the outline of the house, now made dark by the bright rising sun. She found herself checking all around for people as Johnny had been doing since he arrived. Johnny's tense hand tugged her along until she finally stopped resisting quite so much. His overly alert manner made her a little nervous. He was always a little concerned when she was out in public, but never like this. Eliza wondered what would make Johnny seem so worried. Occasionally the child tried to release her grip and pull away, but more out of testing than actually seeking freedom. "Let me go," she protested, this time mindful of the protective shroud of silence around them. "You know better than to go wandering off on your own," he scolded. "If Miss Johnson ever finds out about your little escapades, she won't be pleased. It's not fair. I never get out of the house. Josie Sue talked ever so much about the park and the flowers and the trees. Why can't I ever go and see them?" He stopped briefly and tipped her chin upward with his hand. Looking her straight in the eye, he said, "You're right. It's not fair, but you just can't. People will see you and they'll talk. It might lead to trouble for all of us. Besides," he stopped short to listen as the wind rustled through the trees. Remembering the hour, he let it go and hastened on. Under normal circumstances in this time and place, those of differing colors had little to do with one another unless forced. The town was so lonely and empty at this hour that it seemed almost worse to think that you might encounter another being. It was like the feeling of walking past a graveyard in the darkened night. The burned-out shape now lay in shadow behind as they scurried onward. Now that its spell had been broken, it seemed like something you'd want to move away from as quickly as possible. Every slight noise caused Johnny to pull Eliza Beth in close to his side as he spun his head around to find the source. At the house, it had been as if Eliza's heart was afraid to beat for fear of rousing the skull. Now it was making up for lost time, beating strong and fast. They turned the corner at the end of the next block, and the house was finally out of sight. But Eliza kept glancing back as though the skull might be following them. Once, when looking back, Eliza caught a glimpse of a very tall and large man. His face was weary as a man who bore a great burden for a long time. She looked to Johnny, wondering if she ought to mention it. When she looked again, the giant of a man was nowhere in sight. With the glare of the sun and troubles of the morning, she was no longer sure he'd been there. She decided to keep her peace. They came to a paved street and turned toward the center of town. Ahead at the crossroads, all directions led to larger towns, the largest of which was Lawford, the seat of the next county. That meant this little street saw a lot of traffic on most days, but usually only on weekdays. They would turn well before the crossroads. As they walked, Eliza continued to wonder about a great many things. Yet Johnny seemed so tense that she didn't dare ask any more questions. They only needed to travel 2 blocks up Twillinger Avenue, but because Johnny constantly stopped to investigate the route and listen for traffic, it seemed to take hours. They only heard cars a couple of times over the silent morning air. The first car stopped somewhere in the distance. The second time, Johnny even saw the car approaching the main intersection ahead of them. He paused, wondering what to do. Eliza noticed Johnny's grip become firmer as he pulled her closer to his side. The car turned west on Main Street toward Lawford. It was so far away that Johnny figured they escaped notice. He relaxed his grip and the pair hastened onward. Finally, they turned east onto Oakwood Street. The further they got from the main street, Johnny's grip and pull on Eliza's hand loosened. The people who lived down Oakwood were already aware of Eliza's existence at the orphanage, which was otherwise only white children. The orphanage's neighbors might have had a bad opinion of the orphans and been ignorant about black folks in general, but they were not evil people. They knew enough to keep their mouths shut around town, and that terrible things might happen if they didn't. The pair eventually came to a block with 2 large buildings on opposite corners, along with a row of 3 unkept homes and a large barn. The small town had grown enough to swallow up the farmland once surrounding the barn. The largest structure, Townsend Elementary School, was an old 2-story building made of red bricks and limestone framed windows. On the opposite corner sat the orphanage, housed in a large wooden building that had been an unusually grand home in its day. Some of the trim was missing and the yellow paint was faded and peeling, but it was still standing strong. They were almost home. As they crossed the street by the school, the town's police car eased around the corner, making its rounds. Johnny's heart raced as Chief Barton rolled to a stop near him and said, "What brings you out so early, boy? You had best take your young friend and get on home. There's too many curious folk around here. It's best not to give them anything to be curious about, if you understand me." The chief stopped to listen to the police radio. "Chief, have you gotten started on that new round of eviction notices yet? The demolition crew needs to get into the old Williams place today." Chief Barton's head dropped ever so slightly, and he let out a heavy sigh. He took up the mouthpiece and replied, "Just started my shift, Mayor. I'm on my way out there right now." "Good, good. I was afraid I'd need to remind you who signs your paychecks again. Best get on with it, then." "I sure liked it better when dispatch wasn't in City Hall." Turning to Johnny, the chief continued, "That's all, boy. Move along now." The chief began to roll up his window, but then added, "Oh, one more thing, boy. Give this to Miss Johnson." The chief pulled an envelope out of a large stack and handed it to Johnny. Then he finished rolling up the window and slowly rolled off. Johnny looked carefully at the envelope, turning it over in his hand before sticking it in his pocket and promptly forgetting about it. Fortunately, Floyd Barton, the police chief, already knew of Eliza's presence at the orphanage, and Johnny figured he was generally an honorable man. Chief Barton didn't approve of everything the leaders of the town did or neglected to do. He did his best to try to prevent bad things from coming to a head, but when there was trouble, he often turned a blind eye. Continuing onward, the pair passed a worn dirt playground between the school and the home. The girl eyed it with great longing since the orphanage only had monkey bars. The playground had swings, teeter-totters, a slide, and a merry-go-round, but she could only visit it on occasion and never on weekdays. Eliza left the home as little as possible, despite her numerous protests. People always agreed that it wasn't fair, but that seldom changed the outcome. She decided it wasn't a good day to complain and said nothing. Behind the teeter-totters there was a place in the fence where the boards were loose. Johnny and Eliza ducked through and came out behind the old red barn on the orphanage lot. The barn was in the process of falling down, one board at a time, and was strictly off limits to the children. From there they followed the well-worn path to the back door of the orphanage. Surrounding the orphanage was a white picket fence with a gate at the front and a worn wooden sign that read Townsend Orphanage. Like the building, the fence and the sign were also in desperate need of a fresh coat of paint. Johnny opened the back door and the pair slipped in otherwise unseen by the outside world. Or perhaps not. He wasn't entirely comfortable with Chief Barton catching them, and he thought any number of people could have been peering out the windows of the homes they'd passed. On top of this, Johnny wasn't even aware of Eliza's giant. He wondered if the old path in the woods might have been a better route home, even with young Eliza in tow. The home directly across the street from the orphanage was an old two-story building, with a large attic poking out from under the roof through two tall, thin dormers. There was a small cupola, like a tiny building at the very top of the roof with one large window on each side. Esther Mae Jackson's husband had built the home for her on their anniversary many years earlier. 10 years had now passed since her husband died. The sun rose above the neighboring rooftops and glared brightly off the windows of the cupola. If Johnny had looked closely up at the window, perhaps he would have made out the dark shadow of an old woman watching them enter the orphanage. Widow Jackson liked to sit in her old wicker rocker in her cupola. She watched the outside world with her late husband's trusted hunting rifle open and ready in her lap. From her high vantage point, she watched the two children from the moment they rounded the corner on Oakwood. She was staring intently at the corner for several moments before they appeared, as though searching for someone expected. Very little that happened in the neighborhood escaped her notice, but she wasn't in the habit of turning it into gossip. Widow Jackson muttered, "Boy, I see you had to go out early this morning to retrieve your young friend. Did you think you could keep her tucked away in that home forever? I bet you're hoping you've gone unnoticed. The chief isn't the only one with eyes, my young man. Not the only one with eyes, indeed." She was right. Many blocks away, a large man was looking up and down the street. He seemed to be searching for someone. His face had gone pale and sweaty as though he'd seen a ghost. He passed a handkerchief across his brow and muttered, "Confounded conscience just pestering me again." Nothing more.